I'm gonna make these popular app covers realistic using Photoshop. Starting with an app called Idle Airplane Ink Tycoon. It's kind of a long name, but the cover is pretty simple and I think it'll look pretty cool realistic. So first I recreated the background gradient and then used the pen tool to cut out a passport from this image. I added the passport onto our main image and warped it a little bit, but next I changed the color of the book to blue and then removed the color from the papers and made them more white. I also made the design on the front more gold. I added a shadow to the left side of the passport and then cut the background out from this pilot hat. I added the hat back to our main image and warped it a little bit, but I also made it more blue and then added some highlights on the top of the hat, kind of like the original. I added a camera raw filter to remove the noise and make it more smooth, and after that I added a shadow coming from the hat. But the original has a gold thing on the hat, so I grabbed an image from a different hat and then cut out the gold thing. I put it on top of the hat and changed the angles, but the original hat already has a design on it, so I used the spot healing brush and colored over it until it was just all blue. And then I added the gold thing back with the color overlay to make it look similar to the other gold thing. I added some shadows behind it onto the hat and then made some other small changes, but this is my realistic version of the app. I'm actually pretty happy with this design. I think it looks pretty nice, but that's only the first app, so let's move on to the next one. This app is called Peglin, and it has a lot of good reviews. I've never actually played it, but it seems pretty cool. And I spent a couple hours designing this cover until I just admitted to myself that it looked horrible and then restarted. But I think the reason it looks so bad is because when I recreated the character's body, I went around the outline and it kind of made him look fat. So instead, I traced over only the green parts with the brush tool, as well as remaking the satchel, and this is what I had. Also, I just kept the same background from before since I thought it looked fine. I recreated the ears with the brush tool and some shadows, and then added a skin-like texture on top, and then just added that texture onto the rest of the head, and added some shadows on the ears and on top of the head. I added more shadows around the rest of the character, like on the arms, below the head, and coming from the satchel. I added some skin textures to the arms and legs, and then warped each one around the body part. I added the same texture on top of the body and warped it, and then faded it onto the other skin textures to look more natural. I put the blending mode to multiply and then started working on the face. And after remaking the eyes, I added a bevel and emboss and then an iris on top. And the eye was kind of confusing, but after it looked good, I added some outer bevels onto the eyes and then retraced the nose. I added the same texture on it and then added some highlights on top and then some shadows to the right. I added some shadows onto the ground coming from the character's feet and then some lighter shadows on top of that coming from the body. So this is Peglin, but realistic. I spent like 4 hours on this design because I messed up the first time I tried, but I think that made finishing it more refreshing because I had to do it over. It's not perfect, but I think it looks pretty nice, so let's move on to the next design. Now I'm gonna make this app called Brilliant look realistic, which is kind of weird because nothing in this image is even a real thing, but I have an idea, so I'll start off by adding the same background color and then adding a yellow light coming from the bottom. Then I copied the character's shape and adjusted the colors and added a slime or jelly kind of texture on top of it. I added some depth to the top with a bevel and emboss and then copied the eye shape. And next I warped an eye texture around it and then used the spot healing brush to just remove the eyeball. I changed the levels and then added some shadows on the inside and the outside of it. I added an eyeball and warped it and then put it in a square and then changed the colors and added some shadows on the outside. So here's the realistic version of Brilliant. The next app cover I'm going to make realistic is for an app called Forest Island. It seems to be a pretty relaxing game, and it also has some pretty good reviews. And when I was scrolling through the App Store, the fox stood out to me, and I thought it would be interesting to see this come to life. So I started by recreating the background gradient and then added a snowy landscape image and only left the front. I also added some realistic trees to replace the trees in the original and adjusted the coloring. Next, I added a bunch of stars in the same position as the stars in the original, and then started cutting out the background from this fox image. Once I added it onto the main image, I warped it a tiny bit and then added some shadows onto the back of the fox. I also made the front part of the fox more white and then made the rest of the fur the same shades of orange as the original. And that's basically it. So this is my realistic cover for Forest Island. The second to last app cover I'm going to make realistic is for an app called Last War Survival. And this app is notorious for its fake ads, which actually look more fun than the real game. But once again, I've never played these games before. But for this app cover, I'm not going to make it look exactly identical because I want to put a real person where this soldier is. But before I did that, I replicated the red and blue barriers to the best of my ability and then added some cement textures on top of it. But before I could place those, I had to recreate the floor, and after that I had to recreate the sky with the same colors as the original, and I also just added some clouds to make it a little bit more realistic. But following that, I added a texture onto the ground and then made it a little bit more bright the closer it got to the edge. I also added a slight touch of blue onto the edge that you can barely see, but then I added the blue barrier onto the image and put it at the correct angle, and then I'll just do the same with the red one. I added some shadows below them onto the ground, but next it was time to add the realistic person, and I found this image of a soldier with a gun, and I thought it actually kind of worked perfectly, so I cut them out from the background and then placed them onto our cover, which isn't going to look the exact same, but they're basically doing the same thing, so you get the point. I added a small shadow onto the ground and changed the color of the pants and helmet to blue, as well as changing the guns to a dark gray. And then I took out all of the color on the rest of the suit and made it a little brighter, and then added a bevel and emboss for some easier lighting. And finally, I added some cracks onto the glass to make it look like it was shot instead of having these numbers there. So this is my realistic version of Last War Survival. Even though it's not exactly identical, I think this one's actually pretty cool. But let's move on to our final app cover of the video, which is for an app called Castle Doombad. Once again, I haven't played this game, but I thought the cover looked cool, and I thought it would look even cooler if it was realistic. So to start, I used the pen tool to create a shape that looked like the original, and then made another one that was a little bit darker and made a clipping mask. I used the pen tool again to make another shape replicating the top half of the face, and then added the darker parts. I don't know exactly what this guy is wearing, but it looks kind of like an evil hoodie, so I replicated the bottom of it with the pen tool and then did the same with the top half. I made a little shadow on the bottom half like the original and did the same for the top as well. And then I added a cloth type of texture and used the warp tool to shape it around the left side, and then added another one onto the rest of the hoodie and faded them together. I added a little shadow in the middle of the hoodie like the original and then added another cloth texture. I shaped this one to look like the bottom half of the hoodie with the warp tool, and then added some shadows coming from the part of the hoodie that goes over the other part. Then I used the rectangle tool to add a rectangle onto the middle of his face. I added a cement texture on top, changed the blending mode to multiply, and then adjusted the levels. I also added a color overlay to have the same color as the original, and then added the cement texture onto the bottom part of the face. For this one, I added a gradient overlay because in the original it's kind of blue, so I changed the colors on the overlay and added some shadows onto the face coming off of the hoodie. I used the brush tool to draw the circles onto the face and then colored them in and set the blending mode to multiply and adjusted the opacity. Next, I used the quick selection tool to select the yellow part and made it all yellow. And after that, I warped a gold type of texture on top of it before adding a bevel and emboss. Next, I used the quick selection tool again to copy the shape of the left eye and then change the color. After that, I changed the blending mode and added a bevel and emboss, and then colored in the red parts. I added some brighter red to the eyes to make it look like it's glowing a little bit. I used the ellipse tool and the warp tool to recreate the right eye and added a bunch of layer styles to make it look similar to the other eye's style. And then I added some triangles to the face and some other small edits, but this is my realistic cover of Castle Doombad. Comment which cover was your favorite and subscribe for more.